You ever have one of those moments, quiet, ordinary, that changes everything? I had mine on a Tuesday. Nothing dramatic, no lightning bolt from the sky. Just me sitting in my car after work staring at the steering wheel like it might hand me answers. I was exhausted, not just physically, but soul-deep tired. Worn out from trying to be everything for everyone, smiling when I wanted to scream, saying yes when I was already drowning in no. And then it hit me. I had spent so much time trying to be what they needed, I forgot to be who I am. That was the day I decided to go silent. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I finally had something to become. If this message speaks to something tender and true in you, take a moment, like, subscribe, share, or leave a comment. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Let's keep growing together, one honest moment at a time. You know, sometimes the world gets so loud that you forget what your own voice sounds like. I remember sitting in that car on that quiet Tuesday afternoon, and it felt like the first time I'd heard silence in months. Not the kind of silence that comes from a lack of noise, but the kind that comes from the absence of performance, the absence of pretending. I wasn't trying to be productive. I wasn't trying to please anyone. I wasn't filtering my emotions to make anyone else comfortable. I was just there, alone, breathing. And in that space, I finally heard myself whisper a truth I had ignored for far too long. I can't live like this anymore. That whisper, that was the first sign of life from the real me, the me buried under everyone else's expectations, the me who had been speaking through exhaustion, smiling through heartbreak, and showing up for everyone except herself. It's easy to forget yourself when you've spent years being the glue in other people's stories, when you're the one always checking in, always holding things together, always swallowing your needs like they're too much. But here's what no one tells you. When you neglect yourself long enough, you become a stranger in your own life. In that moment, I didn't rage. I didn't scream. I didn't make some grand declaration. I simply sat there and decided, quietly, softly, that I deserved more. Not more things, not more approval, not more applause. I deserved more presence, more wholeness, more of me. And that's when I began to understand the deep spiritual power of turning inward. Focusing on yourself is not selfish. It's sacred. It's not abandonment, it's remembrance. It's how you return to the parts of you that got lost while you were out proving your worth to people who couldn't even see it. You see, when you stop pouring all your energy outward into keeping the peace, into pleasing, fixing, saving, explaining, you finally start to feel the weight you've been carrying. And it's heavy. My God, it's heavy. But that's the first step. You have to feel it to release it. You have to sit with the ache before you can soften it. And here's the radical part. You don't have to tell anyone what you're doing. You don't have to post it, announce it, or justify it. The quiet decision to focus on your own healing, your own peace, your own growth, that decision alone speaks volumes. Without a single word, you begin to shift. Your energy changes, your presence deepens, you become more rooted, more discerning, more whole. And that's what shocks people. Not because you became someone else, but because you finally became yourself. So if you're in a season right now where you're quieter than usual, softer than you've been, stiller than people expect, let them wonder, let them gossip, let them make up stories. You don't owe anyone a performance. You owe yourself your life. And that's a debt worth honoring. One of the hardest lessons I've learned, and maybe you're learning it too, is that when you start focusing on yourself, not everyone claps. In fact, some of the first people to notice your shift won't cheer. They'll question. They'll look at you through the lens of who you used to be to them, the version of you that was convenient, predictable, always available. And now that you're no longer showing up in the ways that made them comfortable, they'll say things like, "You've changed," as if that's a bad thing. And it hurts, doesn't it? Because deep down, you weren't trying to hurt anyone. You weren't trying to cut people off or prove anything. You were just trying to breathe again, to come up for air. You were trying to finally make space for your own healing, your own voice, your own worth. But growth is strange. It's silent and intimate. It doesn't announce itself with confetti. It often begins with discomfort, and the very people who once leaned on you may feel threatened by the boundaries you're learning to hold. Because when you start focusing inward, you disrupt the unspoken agreements in your relationships, the ones where you gave more than you received, stayed longer than you should have, tolerated more than you ever deserved. And let me tell you the truth that took me years to say out loud. Some people loved you most when you loved yourself the least. Not because they were evil, not because they were villains, but because your lack of boundaries served them. Because your over-giving kept their world spinning. Because as long as you put their needs above your own, they never had to question how little they were giving in return. But that doesn't mean you owe them your exhaustion. It doesn't mean you shrink just to keep them comfortable. It doesn't mean you stay small so others won't feel insecure around your becoming. Focusing on yourself will cost you people. It will cost you habits, distractions, and illusions of connection. But what you gain is priceless. You gain clarity. You start to see who's around you for your light and who is only drawn to your shadow. You gain energy, because no longer leaking it into places where it's wasted means you finally have some left for yourself. And you gain truth, the kind that isn't filtered through someone else's expectations or opinions. And you gain truth, the kind that isn't filtered through someone else's expectations or opinions. The kind that feels like a deep exhaled breath after years of holding it in. You begin to realize that you were never hard to love. You were just surrounded by people who loved the version of you that didn't love yourself. And that's the moment you start coming home to your power. Not the kind that demands attention or makes noise, but the kind that stands quietly, confidently, and says, I matter too. So if you're in that season where people are pulling away because you stopped bending, because you've started choosing you, let them go. Let them drift. Let the space widen. Because the ones meant to walk beside the real you, not the performing you, not the people-pleasing you, they will find you in your silence. They will respect your boundaries. They will recognize your light, not as a threat, but as an invitation. You do not owe your becoming to anyone's comfort. You owe it to yourself. You owe it to the little kid inside who never learned that they were allowed to choose themselves first. And that is not selfish. That is sacred healing. That is love, radical, rooted, and finally yours. Something begins to shift when you stop trying to be everything to everyone. At first, it feels a little strange. You might catch yourself mid-text, wondering if you really need to explain why you're not available, why you're not jumping in, why you're not absorbing someone else's storm anymore. You might wrestle with guilt, that old voice in your head, the one trained by years of overfunctioning, whispers, you're being too cold, too distant, too much. But here's what I've learned, and I say this with all the love in my heart. Guilt is not always a sign you're doing something wrong. Sometimes, guilt is just the emotional residue of breaking a pattern that was never healthy in the first place. And in that unraveling, you start learning about boundaries, not as walls to push people away, but as bridges to your future, as the quiet, sacred agreements you make with yourself to no longer abandon your needs, your time, your energy, just to make someone else feel more secure. I used to believe boundaries were selfish, that saying no was rejection, that protecting my peace made me hard to love. But the truth is, boundaries are the deepest form of self-respect. They are love letters to your future, to the version of you that's no longer available for self-sacrifice disguised as kindness. Boundaries say, I love you, but I also love me. I want to connect, but not at the cost of my well-being. I'm here, but I'm no longer here to be drained. It's not about shutting people out. It's about making sure you don't keep shutting yourself down just to keep the connection alive. And yes, some people won't like your boundaries. That's okay. The ones who respected you only when you were constantly available, they will see your limits as betrayal. They will see your values as sabotaging. They will see your demands as betrayal. But those who truly love you, the ones who value your wholeness more than your usefulness, they will adjust. They will honor the new shape of your presence. They will rise to meet the version of you that finally feels worthy of protecting herself. Let me ask you this. How many times have you said yes out of fear instead of truth? How many times have you agreed to things that made your chest tighten and your spirit shrink? How many times have you been the safe place for everyone else, but had nowhere to fall when you were the one breaking? We live in a world that romanticizes selflessness, but at what cost? You can't pour from an empty soul. You can't light someone else's fire by burning down your own home. You can't keep saying yes to everything and still have space for the things that actually matter. This is your reminder and your permission to start saying no. No to emotional labor that's unpaid and unreciprocated. No to patterns that keep you small. No to being accessible to people who only call when they need something. No to abandoning your peace just to avoid being misunderstood. Because here's the real secret. The more you say no to what's not for you, the clearer your yes becomes. The stronger your center grows. The steadier your spirit becomes. And suddenly, you wake up one day and realize you're no longer living from a place of fear, guilt, or survival. You're living from alignment, from truth, from self-love. That's the shift that changes everything. That's when your life begins to feel like it finally belongs to you. There's a moment in the healing process that no one really prepares you for. It's not loud. It's not marked by some massive breakthrough. It doesn't look like a social media milestone or a finish line you get to post about. It's quiet, almost invisible to the outside world. It's that moment when you're triggered, when someone disrespects you, or the old wound is pressed again. And instead of exploding, instead of shrinking, instead of trying to fix or explain or please, you just pause. You breathe. You ground. You choose peace over reaction. And for the first time, it doesn't feel like defeat. It feels like freedom. That's the kind of healing that's loud in the quietest way. It doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. It doesn't scream, "Look how far I've come." It just is. Like a still river after a storm. Like the sound of your own heartbeat when you're finally alone with yourself and it no longer scares you. Healing doesn't always look like soft blankets and lavender candles and perfectly curated journal pages. Sometimes healing looks like walking away from a conversation that you used to beg to be part of. Sometimes it looks like not responding to the text, not checking their social media, not trying to decode silence, just letting it be, without needing to fix what was never yours to carry. Sometimes healing is sitting at the dinner table with people who never really saw you and choosing to be you anyway. Not smaller, not more palatable, not quieter just to keep the peace. Sometimes healing is choosing to stop chasing closure, realizing that some chapters don't need punctuation. They just need peace. And I'll tell you this, that kind of quiet growth, it shocks people. Because they were used to the version of you that reacted, that defended, that apologized for existing. And suddenly, you're not playing that role anymore. Suddenly, you're not available in the ways they used to count on, not because you're punishing anyone, but because you're finally nourishing yourself. And it will be confusing for them. They might say you've changed, that you've become distant, and maybe you have. But distance isn't always detachment. Sometimes it's recovery. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes it's choosing peace over chaos, healing over attention, truth over performance. Let them wonder where you went. Let them sit with the silence you used to fill. Let them learn to hear the echo of their own absence. Because the more you heal, the less available you'll be for what no longer aligns. Not in a cruel way, not in a bitter way, in a sacred, self-honoring way. A way that says, I love me too much to stay stuck in cycles that drain me. I've done the work. I've faced the shadows. I've sat in the dark long enough to know I am the light. And so I want to say thank you so much to that kind of healing. It speaks for itself. You don't need to convince anyone you've changed. You just need to live the change. Breathe it, walk it, let it shine through your boundaries, your softness, your strength. And trust me, the people who are meant for the healed version of you, the ones who don't need you to dim your light or explain your silence, they will see you. Not because you're louder now, but because you're finally real. You're finally whole. There comes a point when you no longer feel the need to prove anything to anyone, not because you've stopped caring, but because you've finally started believing. Believing in your worth, believing in your growth, believing that the most powerful transformation isn't the one that's announced, it's the one that's embodied. And this is the part where your silence becomes your revolution. You don't explain anymore. You don't over-apologize. You don't chase after the people who walked away or try to convince others to see your value. You simply live. Not out of spite, but out of alignment. Not to shock others, but to honor yourself. Because you've learned that the loudest form of power isn't shouting, arguing, or demanding attention. It's presence. It's peace. It's walking into a room and not needing to shrink or swell to feel worthy of being there. Worthiness of living, worthy of being there. It's moving through the world as your whole, unedited self, not for performance, but from wholeness. You begin to speak less and observe more. You start showing up with a calmness that unsettles people who once fed on your chaos. You start making decisions that no longer require a vote. And you begin to understand that quiet doesn't mean weak. Quiet means rooted. This is the beauty of doing the inner work, of focusing on yourself, and you become shockingly calm in situations that once made you unravel. You no longer need to defend your growth. Your actions, your peace, your glow, they do all the speaking for you. And here's the incredible part. People notice. Oh, they notice. They notice the peace you carry now. The fact that you're not engaging in the same old patterns. The fact that your eyes don't hold desperation, but clarity. That you're not trying to win anyone anymore. You're not trying to be chosen. You've already chosen yourself. And for some, that will be unsettling because they were used to your insecurities, to the version of you who always needed validation, always sought permission. That version made other people feel powerful until she didn't exist anymore. Now you're simply living. Quietly, fully, authentically. And it's beautiful. You wake up without dread in your chest. You trust yourself in ways you never imagined. You're not available for manipulation, for chaos, for emotional breadcrumbing. You don't argue with those committed to misunderstanding you. You just keep going. That's how you shock them. Not with revenge, not with loud exits, not with rage or explanation, but with your peace, with your growth, with your stillness, with the quiet power of knowing exactly who you are and no longer needing anyone else to co-sign that truth. So take this in. You do not need to shout to be heard. You do not need to prove to be worthy. You do not need to be seen to be whole. You just need to be real, rooted, and quietly on fire. Because when you focus on yourself, when you stop leaking your energy into empty spaces, when you begin to rise inwardly, the world notices. Even if they don't say it out loud, even if they pretend not to see it, your evolution speaks volumes. Let it. Let them feel it in the way you no longer reach, in the way you no longer reach, in the way you no longer perform, in the way your silence has become a sanctuary instead of a sentence. You're not who you used to be. You're becoming someone softer, wiser, truer, and maybe the most radical thing you'll ever do in this life is love yourself enough to walk away from anything that keeps you small and never explain why. So if you're listening to this today and you're tired, quietly tired, I want you to know you are allowed to retreat. You are allowed to rebuild. You are allowed to shock the world by no longer betraying yourself just to keep the peace. Let the silence speak for you. Let the transformation whisper from your walk. Let your healing scream through your wholeness. And if no one's told you today, I'm proud of you. Not because you're perfect, but because you're trying. That's enough. You're enough. Now go focus on yourself, not to prove them wrong, but to remind yourself you were always right to begin with.